Imagine a company knew their product was slowly poisoning millions of people. Not just workers, not just nearby residents, every single person on Earth. And they didn't just keep selling it. They lobbied governments, silenced scientists, and buried the evidence for over 50 years. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is documented fact. And the man at the center of it all, he's responsible for more deaths than almost any individual in modern history. And you've probably never heard his name. His name was Thomas Midgley Jr., and in the 1920s, he solved one of the biggest engineering problems of the age. Car engines were knocking, misfiring, destroying themselves from the inside. The whole automobile industry needed an answer, fast. Midgley found one. Lead. Specifically, a compound called tetraethyl lead, a colorless, sweet-smelling liquid that, when added to gasoline, made engines run smoother than anyone had ever seen. The company behind it? Standard Oil, backed by General Motors and DuPont. Three of the most powerful corporations in America, all united around a single product they called ethyl. Leaded gasoline, not lead fuel. Ethyl. Clean, harmless sounding, branded. Because they already knew what lead did to people. Workers in the first tetraethyl lead plants were going insane, hallucinating, seizing, dying. One factory was nicknamed the House of Butterflies because the workers kept swatting at bugs that weren't there. And when journalists started asking questions, Midgley himself held a press conference. He poured the compound over his hands. He inhaled it directly. He smiled for the cameras and said, "I'm doing this every day. There's nothing to worry about." He then secretly took several months off to recover from lead poisoning. What followed was one of the most calculated, devastating cover-ups in corporate history. But here's the thing that doesn't get talked about enough. There was already a safer alternative in 1923. Ethanol. Cheap, clean, already being used in some cars. Standard Oil knew. General Motors knew. They chose lead anyway. Not because it was the only option, but because they could own it. You can't patent alcohol. Any farmer could make it. But tetraethyl lead? That was theirs. So the question isn't just, how did they hide the danger? The real question is, who let them? Dr. Alice Hamilton and early public health advocates who fought back and were crushed. The 1925 Surgeon General's Conference, how regulators gave leaded gas a green light under industry pressure, 50 years of poison. The mass poisoning of the 20th century. What the data shows about IQ loss, crime rates, and health across generations. Geochemist Claire Patterson, who discovered the truth and had his funding pulled by oil companies for decades. Before leaded gasoline ever touched a single road, before one drop was pumped into one tank, someone was already warning them. A doctor. A researcher. Now, back to Dr. Hamilton. By the time the 1920s rolled around, she was already the most dangerous person in America, if you happen to run a factory. Hamilton was the first woman ever appointed to the faculty at Harvard Medical School. She pioneered the entire field of industrial toxicology, the science of how workplace chemicals destroy the human body. Lead wasn't new to her. She'd spent decades walking through smelters, paint factories, and printing plants, watching workers lose their minds, their coordination, their lives, and then tracing it all back to one element. She knew exactly what lead did. It crosses the blood-brain barrier. It mimics calcium, so your body welcomes it in, carries it straight to your bones, your organs, your brain. And once it's there, it doesn't leave. So when Standard Oil announced they were putting it in gasoline, in every car, on every street, in every city in America, Alice Hamilton didn't write a strongly worded letter. She went to war. In 1925, the U.S. Surgeon General called a conference. Industry on one side, public health on the other. Hamilton showed up ready. She laid out the science, the factory deaths, the neurological damage, the way lead accumulates in the body over time. She argued that releasing it into the air through exhaust meant no one could escape exposure, rich or poor, young or old. The whole atmosphere would become a slow drip of poison. The industry's response? They didn't debate the science. They attacked her. She was called emotional, alarmist. One industry representative told the conference, and I want you to really hear this, there are no cases of lead poisoning recorded in the manufacture of ethyl gasoline. Which was technically true, because the workers who died had their deaths recorded as pneumonia, heart failure, unknown causes. The lead connection was simply never written down. Hamilton called it exactly what it was, a deliberate erasure of evidence. But here's what nobody tells you about that 1925 conference. Hamilton and the public health advocates, they actually won the argument. The science was on their side. The logic was airtight. Even some government officials in the room privately agreed with her. And it didn't matter. At all. Because winning the argument and winning the decision are two completely different things. The Surgeon General's committee ruled that there was, quote, no good grounds for prohibiting the use of ethyl gasoline. They recommended more research, a follow-up study, to be funded in part by the industry itself. Alice Hamilton kept fighting for years after that, writing papers, giving lectures, lobbying Congress. But the gasoline was already flowing. 50 million cars would eventually run on leaded fuel in America alone. And every single one of them was exhaling invisible poison into the air that everyone breathed. Hamilton lived to be 101 years old, long enough to watch the damage unfold across generations. The lead was already inside all of us. Now, you might be wondering, if the science was this clear, if people were dying, if doctors were screaming from the rooftops, how did it keep going for another 50 years? The answer isn't complicated. It's actually one of the oldest moves in the corporate playbook. You don't silence the truth. You just make sure nobody with power ever has to listen to it. And in 1926, they found the perfect way to do exactly that. After the 1925 Surgeon General's Conference, a committee was formed. 7 men, tasked with studying the long-term health effects of leaded gasoline. Sounds reasonable. Until you hear the timeline. The study lasted 1 year. 1 year to assess the long-term effects of a toxin that accumulates in the body over decades. And the data? Drawn almost entirely from workers already employed by the industry. Men whose health records were controlled by the very companies under investigation. Alice Hamilton saw the problem immediately. She warned that asking industry to police itself on lead poisoning was like asking a river to measure its own flooding. A year later, the committee released its findings. No significant health deterioration. Leaded gasoline was declared safe. Just like that, the debate was over. Officially. Except the workers they studied carried a different story. Decades later, follow-up research found substantial lead accumulation in their bones. The committee hadn't looked long enough to see it. Or They hadn't wanted to. With the committee's ruling in hand, Standard Oil moved quickly. What began as a regional fuel additive became a national standard. By 1936, most gasoline sold in the United States contained lead. By 1950, avoiding it was nearly impossible. And the consequences were everywhere. Every time a car engine ran, microscopic lead particles were blasted into the air through the exhaust. They settled onto streets, playgrounds, homes, and farmland. In cities packed with traffic, lead dust accumulated year after year on windowsills, sidewalks, and the soil where children played. People inhaled it, they tracked it indoors, they unknowingly ingested it. Lead poisoning rarely looked like poisoning. Instead, it appeared as fatigue, irritability, learning difficulties, behavioral problems, or trouble concentrating. Symptoms that could be blamed on almost anything. The people responsible for investigating those patterns had already decided the problem wasn't worth finding. The agencies responsible for regulating fuel additives were deeply intertwined with the industries they oversaw. Officials moved from oil companies into government positions and back again. Industry advisors helped shape regulations that affected their former employers, and often their future employers too. None of this was hidden. It was simply considered normal. So when researchers warned about rising levels of lead in the atmosphere, or pediatricians reported troubling neurological patterns in children, the response was predictable. The evidence was inconclusive. More research was needed. The issue wasn't urgent. Questions that should have triggered investigations became footnotes. Meanwhile, Ethyl Corporation, the company created to market tetraethyl lead, generated enormous profits for decades. An entire society had been exposed to a potent neurotoxin for decades without understanding the scale of the risk, and children paid the highest price. Lead is especially harmful during early brain development. It interferes with the formation of neural connections responsible for learning, attention, memory, and self-control.
Today, health authorities recognize that there is no known safe level of lead exposure for children. Yet, for half a century, children grew up surrounded by lead-contaminated air and soil. Researchers estimate that lead exposure from gasoline shifted the cognitive potential of entire generations downward before many children ever entered a classroom. And that may not be the most disturbing finding. In the 1990s, researchers noticed something strange. As the generation raised after the lead phase-out reached adulthood, violent crime rates began falling. The pattern appeared across multiple countries. The theory remains debated, but the correlation was striking. Less lead exposure, 20 years pass, crime declines.
The proposed mechanism wasn't mysterious. Lead damages the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain involved in judgment, impulse control, and long-term decision-making. If exposure affects millions of children, the consequences may eventually appear not just in medical records, but across society itself, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. For decades, policymakers searched for explanations for rising crime, educational struggles, and widening social problems. Some of the answer may have been sitting in the dust along the side of the road. And the burden wasn't shared equally. Communities located near major traffic corridors, often poorer and disproportionately black, received far higher levels of exposure than wealthier neighborhoods farther from busy roads. The same communities facing economic barriers were also subjected to some of the highest concentrations of environmental lead.